They gave my life an expiration date, 3 years. That was how long they let me believe I still had a purpose in their world. 3 years of appointments I was never allowed to question, of results I was never allowed to see, of a husband who stood with his back to me every single time the doctor delivered another verdict. 3 years of being told the same thing in different ways, each version a little colder than the last, until the word itself stopped feeling like a diagnosis and started feeling like a name. Barren. My name is Mara, and this is the story of what happened when they tried to make that word my entire identity. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am not going to tell you this story from the floor. I am not going to tell it to you with tears running down my face or with my voice breaking in the places where it still hurts. I have already done all of that. Alone, in a bathroom, in a palace room that smelled of antiseptic and false hope. And later, in a forest under a full moon, running so fast the snow turned to blur beneath my feet. I am going to tell you this from the other side. So when I describe the parking lot, understand that I am describing it the way you describe a scar you have stopped being ashamed of. I can trace every detail, the smell of sleet on hot asphalt, the sound of 4 black SUVs idling in the dark, the way the yellow light above the loading dock flickered every 7 seconds, as if even the electricity was uncertain about what it was being asked to witness. I was wearing a gray dress, thin fabric, cap sleeves, the kind of dress you wear to a Sunday brunch when you are trying to look like you are not trying. It was November in Seattle, and the temperature had dropped below freezing an hour before, but I had walked out of the Voss estate without a coat, and I was not going to put one on now. Brennan had tried. He held out his jacket at the door, his face doing that thing it always did when he knew he had done something unforgivable and was hoping a small gesture would blur the edges of it. I looked at the jacket. I looked at him. I walked past him without taking it. I was not going to carry anything of theirs into whatever came next. The drive to the industrial park had taken 11 minutes. I had counted. Not because I was nervous, but because my mind needed something precise to hold on to. 11 minutes, 3 turns, 1 railroad crossing. The kind of neighborhood where buildings are the color of old concrete and the signs have been faded by weather into near illegibility. Neutral ground, the paperwork had called it, as if the location was doing me a courtesy. I stepped out of the car and the sleet hit me immediately, a fine, sharp mist that was not quite rain and not quite ice, the kind that gets into the hinges of your jaw and makes your back teeth ache. I did not flinch. I had made myself a promise in the bathroom mirror at 4 that morning. Standing in my slip with the water running cold, looking at a face I had spent 3 years learning not to recognize, I had made myself a promise that I would not flinch tonight. Not once. Alpha Graydon Voss got out of the car behind me. He was a large man, the kind of large that takes up space on purpose, and he moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he had entered for 30 years. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one with the brass buttons, which told me he considered this a formal occasion. He was not wrong. He was just the only one who was going to be celebrating. He did not look at me. He had not looked at me directly in 3 years, I realized. Not really. He looked at the space slightly to my left, or at the folder he was always carrying, or at his son, but never at me. I had thought that was indifference. Now I understood it was something else. It is harder to sell something you have looked in the eyes. The 4 black SUVs were already there when we arrived, engines running, exhaust rising white in the frozen air. The emblem on the doors was subtle, a gold wolf's head wearing a crown of thorns, and if you did not know what it meant, you might have thought it was a private security company or a corporate detail of some kind. But every wolf in the Pacific Northwest knew that emblem. The Royal Legion, the personal guard of the Alpha King. I stood on the gravel and I breathed. I had not slept. I want to be honest about that. The night before my own sale, I had lain on my side of the king bed I had shared with Brennan for 3 years, and I had stared at the ceiling until the numbers on the clock stopped meaning anything. I had gone through it all, every version of how this night could end, and I had made myself look at each one without looking away. That is what you do when you have been told for 3 years that you are broken. You stop flinching at things that used to frighten you. You have already seen the worst version. Everything else is just detail. The door of the lead SUV opened and a man stepped out. He was not what I expected. He was not particularly large, not the kind of physical presence I associated with the Legion. He wore a tactical suit, dark, fitted, and he moved with the economy of someone trained to do a great deal in very little time. He was carrying a clipboard. He put on dark glasses despite the fact that it was nearly 10 at night and the parking lot was lit by a single flickering overhead lamp. He looked at the clipboard. "Item 404, he said. His voice was flat and professional. The voice of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Female, 24. Status, null. He looked up and his gaze moved past me, past Graydon, settling somewhere in the middle distance. "That's her?" "That's her," Graydon said. He was already reaching into his coat for the paperwork. The folder was thick, I noticed. 3 years of appointments, of results, of a medical record I had never been permitted to read in full. 3 years of my own body, documented and summarized and filed by a man who smelled of antiseptic and peppermint and, I had recently understood, deception. I remember thinking about that smell. Dr. Stellan Prent. I had been in his examination room 47 times over 3 years. I had counted that too, in the small hours of the morning when counting was the only thing that kept me present in my own life. 47 visits. 47 rounds of the same conversation, each one a little more final than the last. And every time, underneath the sharp chemical smell of the examination room, that same undercurrent. Antiseptic and peppermint, clean and sweet and completely wrong. I had not been able to name what was wrong about it until last week, until I had caught a different doctor, a woman at an urgent care clinic across town where I had gone with a sprained wrist Brennan did not know about, looking at the inside of my arm where the injection sites had left faint marks. She had not said anything. She had just looked at me with an expression I could not read and then looked away. But something in that look had stayed with me, sitting under my sternum like a splinter I could not reach. Tonight, standing in a freezing parking lot in a thin gray dress while a man with a clipboard cataloged me as inventory, I finally understood what that splinter was. It was the beginning of a question I had not yet been allowed to finish asking. Graydon handed over the paperwork. The soldier flipped through it with practiced efficiency, signed at the bottom of the last page, and tore off a yellow copy which he handed back to Graydon. Debts cleared. The books balanced. 32 years of gambling. Of bad investments. Of the kind of financial recklessness that other men hid from their wives and their packs. Erased in a single transaction. The transaction was me. I looked at the second SUV. The soldier had told me to get in. I took one step toward it. Then I stopped. I do not know why I stopped. Later, I would understand it differently, would have language for the thing that made my feet go still on the frozen gravel. But in that moment, I only knew that something had shifted in the air around me. Not the weather, not the temperature, something else. Something that pressed against the inside of my chest like a hand against a door. I turned around. I do not know what I intended. To say something to Graydon, perhaps. To finally ask the question that had been living under my sternum for a week. To say the one true thing I had been composing in my head for 3 years, without ever finding the right moment to speak it. But when I turned, Graydon was already looking past me, his eyes wide, his hand pressed flat against his chest. Behind him, his 2 pack enforcers were on their knees on the gravel, whimpering, not down on one knee, the way a wolf shows respect. Both knees. The posture of a wolf who has encountered something so far above them on the hierarchy that their body has simply removed the question of whether to submit. The air pressure dropped. It was the only way I could describe it then. And it is still the most accurate description I have. The air pressure dropped, the way it does before a storm, except faster and more complete. And for a moment, every sound in the parking lot, the idling engines, the sleet on the asphalt, Graydon's labored breathing, became very distant, as if I was hearing them through water. The rear door of the third SUV, the one with the armored plating that I had assumed was equipment storage, opened. A boot hit the asphalt. Then another. The man who stepped out was not built the way most powerful men are built, with the visible architecture of strength, the broad display, the deliberate presence. He was simply large in the way that certain things in nature are large. The way old trees are large, the way mountain ridges are large, with the kind of mass that you understand all at once, and then keep understanding deeper and deeper the longer you look. He was wearing a suit the color of charcoal, bespoke, the kind of garment that was not chosen to impress, but simply happened to fit perfectly because everything else would have been inadequate. He wore no coat. The sleet was falling around him, but I noticed, with the strange clarity that comes in moments of extreme stillness, that it was not touching him. The sleet was melting before it reached him. His hair was black, not dark brown, not very dark, but black, the true black of a raven's wing, swept back from a face that was all planes and angles, and one very fine scar that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down toward his jaw. He moved without haste. There was no urgency in his stride, no performance of power. He simply walked, and the space between him and me decreased, and with it decreased something else. Some ambient noise in my nervous system that I had been living with so long I had stopped hearing it. He walked past the soldier with the clipboard, past Graydon, who had gone so still he looked taxidermied. He walked straight toward me, and I want to tell you that I stepped back, or that I prepared some defense, but I did not. I stood exactly where I was, in my thin gray dress with sleet melting against my collarbone, and I watched him come. He stopped 2 feet from me. I had to tilt my head back slightly to look at him, which I did not enjoy, and which I suspected he understood. His eyes were the color of amber held up to firelight, a deep liquid gold that should not have been possible in a human face. They were not kind eyes, but they were not cruel either. They were the eyes of someone who was accustomed to seeing things clearly and had no interest in pretending otherwise. He leaned toward me. Not aggressively, not quickly. He simply bent his head slightly, bringing his face close to the side of my neck, and he breathed in. One long, slow, deliberate inhalation. The way you breathe in something you have been searching for. My entire body went electric. I do not have a better word for it. Every nerve ending I possessed fired simultaneously, as if some circuit had been completed that had been open my entire life without my knowledge. My knees did not buckle. I held still, but it was the most effortful stillness I had ever maintained. He pulled back. His expression had changed. Something in the planes of his face had shifted, tightened, as if he had just confirmed something that had cost him a great deal to wait for. He turned his head, not quickly, slowly, with the unhurried certainty of a predator who knows the prey is not going anywhere. He looked at Graydon Voss. Who told you this woman was broken? His voice was low, not loud. He did not need volume. The sound of it moved through the air and through the ground and into the bones of everyone present in a way that had nothing to do with acoustics and everything to do with what he was. Graydon's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Your Majesty, she is Barren, verified by our pack physician. 5 separate examinations over 3 years. We offer her as a servant for the court, to settle the regional tithe. She is fit for household service. The kitchens, perhaps. She is young and barren. He repeated the word the way you might repeat something you found at the bottom of a glass you thought was clean. Not angry, disgusted. As if the word itself had revealed something about the person who used it. He turned back to me. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because I have replayed it many times, and I do not want to misrepresent it. He did not look at me with pity. He did not look at me with the kind of deliberate gentleness people use when they are trying to manage someone they consider fragile. He looked at me the way you look at something you recognize, something whose absence has been a specific kind of ache, and the recognition is not relief so much as the cessation of a pain you had learned to call normal. His hand came up, large, warm, the rough texture of someone who has not spent his life behind a desk. His fingers curved around my jaw and tilted my face up toward his. His thumb moved, once, very lightly, across my lower lip. The world stopped making noise. She is not barren. His voice carried across the empty lot, across the idling engines, across Graydon's shallow breathing. It was not a declaration made for my benefit. It was a declaration made for everyone present, a correction entered into the record, irrevocable. Her wolf is not dead. She is sleeping. He held my gaze. In his eyes, the amber had deepened, gone darker and warmer, and I had the disorienting sensation of being seen by someone who was not seeing what they expected to see, but what was actually there. And she smells like mine. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Behind me, I registered the sound of Graydon's voice attempting to form words. Something about the debt, the paperwork, the agreement. I did not listen. I was looking at the king of every wolf pack on the continent, who was looking at me as if 3 years of being told I was worth nothing had been, at best, a clerical error. The debt is cleared, Caden Ashvale said, and his arm came around my waist, drawing me against him with a steadiness that had nothing possessive in it, or rather, everything possessive in it. The kind of possession that goes in both directions simultaneously, that says mine and means it as a promise rather than a claim. Not because you paid it, because you were foolish enough to sell your queen. He looked over my head at the soldier with the clipboard. "Burn the paperwork." Graydon made a sound. It might have been a protest. It might have been the start of a negotiation. It became neither, because Caden's gaze moved to him then. Just once, just for a moment, and whatever Graydon Voss had been about to say dissolved without being spoken. I was lifted. My feet left the gravel. He carried me toward the armored SUV the way you carry something that matters, not carefully, as in delicately, but carefully, as in without haste, without doubt, as if he had always known exactly where he was taking me, and the only question had been the timing. I looked back once, over his shoulder. Graydon Voss was standing in the flickering light of the parking lot, the yellow copy of a transaction receipt still in his hand, staring after us with an expression I had never seen on his face before. He looked small, not physically. Something else had shrunk, some fundamental certainty about how the world was arranged, and without it, he looked like a man standing in a room whose walls have just been removed. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I turned away, because I had said what I needed to say. I had said it at the door of his estate, with sleet beginning to fall, and Brennan's coat still in Brennan's hands, and 3 years of false results folded into a folder I had never been allowed to open. I had said, "Remember the price you put on my head, Alpha Voss," because I will be the one holding the receipt. What I had not known then, standing in the doorway of that house in my thin gray dress, was that the receipt would be paid in something they had never thought to account for. I rested my head against the king's chest as he carried me to the car. Beneath my ear, through the fabric of his suit, I could hear his heart. It was slow, steady. Each beat measured and certain, the rhythm of something very old and very sure of itself. And then, underneath it, I noticed something strange. My own heart, which had been cold and tight and braced for impact for 3 years, was beginning to beat in the same time. Not because he was carrying me, not because I had been rescued, but because something in my chest, something that had been very small and very still for a very long time, had just, for the first time, heard something it recognized. I did not know yet what that meant. I did not know about the heirloom I carried in my blood, or the wolf sleeping beneath 3 years of poison, or the shrine in the old forest, or the ballroom where I would one day stand in silver and make 500 wolves go silent with a single sentence. I did not know any of it yet. I only knew that the sleet was no longer reaching me. And for the first time in 3 years, I was not cold. The limousine did not feel like a limousine. It felt like a held breath. 4 hours between the industrial park and the royal territory. 4 hours of mountain roads curving through the dark forest of the Pacific Northwest. And I spent the first 30 minutes of it cataloging every possible explanation for what had just happened to me. Not because I was ungrateful, not because I was foolish enough to assume the worst about a man who had just publicly refused to treat me as inventory, but because I had spent 3 years learning that the most dangerous moments in my life had been the ones I walked into without asking enough questions first. Caden Ashvale sat across from me. He had opened a laptop before the car had cleared the parking lot, and he was working with the focused efficiency of a man who had a great deal of the world to manage and very little patience for inefficiency. He did not look at me, not directly. But every time I shifted my weight, every time I tucked my bare feet beneath me on the leather seat or pulled the cashmere blanket tighter across my shoulders, His eyes moved. Not a full glance, just a flicker, peripheral and assessing, the way a wolf tracks movement without turning its head. I was aware of it every single time. The blanket had appeared from nowhere, or rather from the hands of a silent attendant who had materialized the moment the car door closed, along with a cup of something hot that smelled of honey and ginger. I was holding the cup with both hands, more for the warmth than anything else, and I was thinking, the debt is cleared. Not because you paid it, because you were foolish enough to sell your queen. Queens were not found in industrial parking lots in November. Queens were not barren women from minor packs with no family, no land, no status, and 3 years of falsified medical records following them like a shadow. I knew what I was. I had been told what I was, thoroughly and repeatedly, by people who had every reason to be honest with me and had chosen not to be. Whatever Caden Ashvale had said in that parking lot, whatever he had meant by mine, I was not naive enough to take it at face value without understanding the architecture beneath it. He needed something. Everyone needed something. The only question was what? A distraction, maybe. A political scandal to redirect attention from something happening at the northern borders, something I had heard whispered about in the Voss household in the weeks before my sale. Or perhaps something simpler. A mate who could not produce heirs meant no succession conflict, no rival claims, no second power base growing up inside his own household. That would be useful to a king who had ruled alone for 10 years and intended to keep ruling alone. I turned the cup in my hands and I looked at him and I thought, what does a man like this actually need from a woman like me? He looked up, not at the road, not at his laptop, at me, directly for the first time since the car had started moving, with those amber eyes that were the specific shade of danger that does not announce itself. You are trying to figure out what I want from you, he said. His voice in the enclosed space of the car was different from what it had been in the parking lot. Lower. Less a weapon, more a register. Like a cello heard from the next room. I did not look away. Yes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, perhaps, or the memory of one. And what have you concluded? Nothing yet. I have a hypothesis. Tell me. You need a mate who cannot challenge your succession, I said. A barren woman from a dissolved pack with no political connections and no family to back her. Clean, uncomplicated, useful for appearances without being dangerous. He looked at me for a long moment. The car moved through a curve, and the headlights swept across a wall of Douglas fir, so tall the tops were invisible in the dark. My wolf has been pacing for 10 years, he said finally, since the night I turned 28 and understood that whatever I was waiting for was not going to be delivered on schedule. He paused. Tonight, the moment you stepped out of that car, he stopped. He has been sitting still for the first time in a decade. He looked back at his screen. I am not a man who ignores information like that. I did not have an answer for that. I sat with it in the space between us, turning the cup in my hands, and I thought, that is either the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most sophisticated thing anyone has ever used to avoid answering a question. I decided I could not know which one yet. I decided I would pay attention. The royal estate emerged from the mountains the way certain things emerge, not gradually, but all at once. A revelation rather than an approach. It was built into the face of a granite ridge above a valley of old-growth forest. The kind of forest that predates names, that was here before the city, before the roads, before anything that called itself civilization arrived and began the work of deciding what belonged where. The estate was not decorative. It was not built to be admired. It was built to last, which is a different thing entirely. The gates were iron, 30 feet high, and they opened without a sound. Inside, the staff was already assembled. 2 lines of them, extending from the main entrance down the stone steps, human and wolf alike, and they bowed as the car door opened, a wave of deference that moved from the front of the line to the back like something in water. I had attended pack galas. I had stood at Graydon Voss's elbow at regional functions where submission was performed and measured and compared. I had never seen anything like this. This was not performance. This was recognition of something they genuinely believed was present. Caden helped me out of the car, his hand under my arm, a brief contact that he released as soon as I was steady. He turned to a woman near the front of the staff line, silver-haired, straight-backed, wearing the kind of composed expression that spoke of decades of competence in a household where competence was the minimum requirement. "East wing," he said. "The suite. Prepare the bath and burn the clothes she arrived in." He paused. "And summon Dr. Wren Calloway. Tonight." I heard myself speak before I had consciously decided to. "No doctors." The words came out quieter than I intended, but steadier than I feared. Caden turned to look at me. Not with impatience, with attention. "Please," I added, because the please was honest, and I was trying to be honest tonight. "They just tell me what I already know." "What do you already know?" I looked at him. The staff were perfectly still around us. The night air smelled of pine and granite and the faint ozone edge that seemed to follow him everywhere. "That I am broken," I said. "I have been told by 5 different examinations over 3 years. I know the result. I do not need another version of it." Something changed in his face, not softened exactly, sharpened but inward, the way a blade sharpens against something it has found to be harder than it expected. "My doctors do not lie," he said. His voice had the particular quiet of someone saying something they have never needed to say before, because it has never been in question. "And if Dr. Calloway finds what I believe she will find, the Silver Creek pack will wish their only problem was money." He held my gaze for one more moment, something passing between us that I did not have language for yet. And then he turned and walked toward the main entrance with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had to wait for a door to be opened for him. I stood on the steps in my thin gray dress and I watched him go. The silver-haired woman appeared at my elbow. "This way, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was entirely neutral on the title, as if she had decided not to have an opinion about it until circumstances made an opinion necessary. I followed her inside. The East Wing was larger than the Voss estate. I want to be clear about the specific absurdity of that, because the Voss estate was not a small house. It was a 6,000 square foot property on a forested hill with a gate and a guard rotation and a wine cellar that Graydon considered his most significant personal achievement. The east wing of the royal palace contained corridors hung with silk tapestries depicting hunts I did not recognize and wolves I could not name. And the bathroom, when the silver-haired woman opened the door, was a room of marble and steam and a tub the size of a small swimming pool already filled with water that was exactly the right temperature in the way that only very expensive things can be exactly right. I lowered myself into the water and I sat very still and I let myself, for the first time, feel how cold I had been. Not the sleet, not the parking lot, the 3-year cold. The cold that had settled into me gradually, so gradually that I had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that has been present long enough to become background. I sat in the hot water, and I felt it begin to leave my bones. And I thought about the yellow copy of the transaction receipt in Graydon's hand, and the way he had looked, small and stripped, standing under the flickering light. I thought about Brennan. I thought about 112 nights in the same bed, about mornings when his arm had been around me before either of us was fully awake, about the specific and ordinary intimacy of 3 years of shared life with someone who had been, for stretches of it, genuinely kind to me. I thought about the way he had stood at the window, his back to me, when his father read out the figures. I thought about the coat, the extended hand, the jacket he had held toward me that I had walked past. I thought, he knew. Not about the poison, maybe. Maybe not about the specific mechanism. But he had driven me to 47 appointments with a man who smelled wrong, and he had never once asked to see the results. That was not ignorance. That was a choice about what not to know. I sank lower in the water, and I decided to stop thinking about Brennan for tonight. Dr. Wren Calloway arrived an hour later. She was older than I expected, somewhere in her 50s, with silver hair cut short and very direct gray eyes and the kind of unhurried competence that I associated with people who had spent decades being the smartest person in the room and had long since stopped needing anyone else to acknowledge it. She set her bag on the vanity table and looked at me where I sat on the edge of the bed in a silk robe that felt like temperature rather than fabric. "He thinks I am his mate," I said before she could begin. I wanted it stated clearly. I wanted it on the table so we were both looking at the same thing. "When you tell him I cannot give him heirs, he will send me to the kitchens. I would rather know that now than be surprised by it." Wren looked at me for a moment. Then she set her glasses on her nose and opened her bag. "Let us just look first," she said. Her voice was the kind of calm that is not absence of feeling, but presence of steadiness. "I find hypotheses work better after evidence." The examination was unlike any examination I had experienced in 3 years with Stellan Prent. Where he had been brisk and clinical, she was meticulous. Where he had summarized his findings verbally, she documented everything in real time, running a portable scanner along my forearm, taking 3 separate blood draws from different sites, reviewing each result on her tablet before moving to the next step. She hummed occasionally, very quietly, a shapeless sound that I gradually understood was not contentment, but concentration. She frowned at the scanner output. She frowned at the blood panel. She frowned at the 3rd draw in a way that made the back of my neck go cold. Then she sat back, took her glasses off, and held them in both hands, and looked at me with an expression that I did not know how to read. It was not pity. It was not the professional neutrality of someone delivering a result they have delivered before. It was something closer to anger, carefully managed, the way you manage anger when you are in the presence of someone who has already been hurt enough. "How long were you seeing Dr. Prent?" she asked. 3 years, since the month after my wedding." "Did he administer injections? Described to you as vitamins or hormonal supplements?" Something went very still in my chest. "Once a week. He said my hormone levels were low, that it was common in female wolves under stress." Wren turned the tablet toward me. The screen showed a toxicology report. I did not understand all of it. I understood enough. A jagged red line ran across the graph like a wound that had never been allowed to close, and the annotation beside it used words I recognized from the basic pack health education I had received as a child. Wolf's Bane. Concentrated, refined, pharmaceutical-grade Wolf's Bane administered in controlled doses over an extended period, and beside it, a second compound, synthetic. The report called it a cycle suppressor. "You are not Barren," Wren said. Her voice was very quiet and very precise. "You have been on high-grade chemical contraceptives for 3 years. The Wolf's Bane suppressed your shift and kept your wolf dormant. The synthetic suppressor prevented conception entirely. Together, they have been slowly poisoning your system in a way that mimics natural infertility with enough consistency to pass a standard pack medical examination." She paused. Dr. Prent is not a bad diagnostician. He was not making errors. He was reporting the results of what he himself was administering. The room did not spin. I want to be precise about that. People describe moments like this as the room spinning, and I understand why. But that was not what happened to me. What happened was that everything became very clear. Extremely, pitilessly clear. The way things look in very bright light when there are no shadows left to soften anything. 3 years, every week. Brennan driving me to the appointment, sitting in the waiting room with his phone, driving me home again. The door opened. Caden stood in the doorway. He had changed. He was wearing a dark sweater, simple, and dark trousers, and he looked, in the soft light of the suite, less like a king and more like a man who had not slept in several days and was not going to start now. He was holding a folder. Not Prent's folder, the one from the parking lot. A different one. "I had my intelligence network begin a background check on your parents the moment we left Silver Creek territory," he said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the small table near the window, not beside me on the bed, not close, but present, deliberate. "I want to tell you what they found. I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." I looked at him. "My parents died in a car accident. I was 4. I have no memories of them that are not from photographs." "Your parents were alphas," he said, "of a faction called the Crescent Moon Rogue. They were not criminals. They were not outlaws. They were wolves who chose to live outside the pack hierarchy because they carried something the pack hierarchy considered destabilizing." He opened the folder. He did not read from it. He had already memorized it. They carried the bloodline of the pure white wolf, a genetic inheritance that appears perhaps once in several generations, and when it does, it produces wolves of unusual power. Your mother was white. Your father carried the secondary marker. You carry both. He held my gaze. They were not killed in an accident. They were hunted by people who understood what their offspring would eventually become and found that prospect inconvenient. The room was very quiet. "Graydon Voss knew," I said. "Not a question. Graydon Voss arranged your marriage to his son," Caden said, "which means he investigated your background, which means he found what I found. A child with the pure bloodline, orphaned, unregistered, living in a foster placement outside the pack system. He took you in a manner of speaking, by ensuring Brennan met you at 19 and found you appealing. By the time you were married, the plan was already in place." He paused. "If you had produced a child with Brennan Voss, that child would have carried the White Wolf bloodline through you and Brennan's alpha genetics. It would have been more powerful than Brennan, more powerful than Graydon. It would have eventually challenged the Voss line for dominance of the entire Southern Territory. He closed the folder. They were not afraid of you being barren. They were afraid of you being fertile. I sat with that. I looked at my hands, which were resting in my lap and were no longer shaking. At some point in the last hour, the shaking had stopped. I was not sure when. So they poisoned me, I said, to keep me manageable. And when they had used everything I had to offer, my dowry, my service, 3 years of silence, they sold me to get rid of me cleanly. Yes. And the poison, I said, can it be reversed? Wren, who had been very quiet during this exchange, leaned forward. With the correct antidote administered consistently, your system will clear within 4 to 5 days. It will not be comfortable. Your wolf will fight to resurface through 3 years of suppression. But once the clearing is complete, you will be fully yourself. The dormancy is not permanent. Nothing they did to you is permanent. I stood up. I went to the mirror above the vanity table, and I stood in front of it in the silk robe, and I looked at my face. I was pale. I had been pale for 3 years. One of the many symptoms I had accepted as simply who I was, a woman whose color had faded, whose edges had softened into uncertainty. My cheekbones were too sharp. My hair, which had been glossy when I was younger, had been dull for so long, I had forgotten it used to be different. But my eyes were doing something I had never seen them do. A faint luminescence, deep in the iris, the color of a bruise backlit by something warm. Purple, violet, the specific shade of something very old waking up. I do not want to be a kitchen servant, I said to the reflection. Behind me, Caden stood. He had moved without sound, which should have alarmed me, and did not. And he was reflected in the mirror over my shoulder, towering, dark, the amber of his eyes steady and certain. You will not be, he said. The winter solstice ball, I said. 3 weeks. Every alpha in the region attends. They are required to. I watched my eyes in the mirror. The violet light was deepening. Graydon will be there. He has no choice. And Brennan, with Isolde Farron. Yes. I turned to face him. We were closer than I had allowed us to be in the car, closer than I had allowed anything since the parking lot. And I looked up at him, and I said the thing I had been composing since I was 4 years old, and someone sat me down and said, "Your parents are not coming back." I do not want them to fear me, I said. I want them to understand what they gave away. Caden looked at me for a long moment. Something in his face was doing what it had done in the parking lot. That recognition, that specific quality of attention that is not observation but witness. Then, he said, "We have 3 weeks. He paused. "I will train you to fight. Wren will clear the poison. And your wolf." He glanced at the mirror, at the violet light still moving in my reflected eyes. "Your wolf will introduce herself on her own schedule." "What if she is not what you expected?" I asked. "What if I am not what you expected?" The corner of his mouth moved. This time it was a full thing, brief and real, the kind of smile that does not know it is happening. "Mara," he said, and it was the first time he had used my name, and it landed differently than I expected, heavier, like something placed with intention rather than dropped. "You are precisely what I have been waiting for. The only surprise is that it took this long." He left without another word, and I stood in front of the mirror in the warm room. and the wolf in my eyes burned violet, and I thought, they told me I was broken for 3 years, and now I am standing in a palace with poison clearing from my blood, and a king down the hall who says I am the thing he has been waiting for, and the wolf, I was told, was dead, opening her eyes for the first time. I pressed my fingers to the glass where my reflection looked back at me with someone else's eyes, someone older, someone who had been sleeping for a long time under borrowed names and other people's diagnoses and was finally, slowly, beginning to wake. The next 4 days were the worst of my life. I want to be honest about that too. Wren had said the clearing would be uncomfortable. What she had meant, I understood by the end of the first day, was that it would feel like dying without the courtesy of actually finishing the job. The wolf's bane leaving my system was not gentle. It did not ease out gracefully. It burned. My bones felt like they were being fractured and reset on a rotation, over and over. The sensation of my skeleton reasserting its actual shape after 3 years of being told to be smaller. My temperature spiked so high by the second night that the air around me shimmered. I did not leave the suite. I barely left the bed. Caden moved his office into the sitting room adjacent to my bedroom. I did not ask him to. He did not explain it. I became aware of it at some point during the second day when the fever had made reality unreliable, when the space between sleep and waking had collapsed into a single continuous state of pain and heat, and the images that rose through it, the parking lot, Brennan's back at the window, the folder, the ink drying on the papers, the cold. I became aware through all of that of a low sound from the next room. Not music, not voices. Just the occasional turn of a page, the soft percussion of a keyboard, the sounds of someone working. Close enough to hear, far enough to give me space. He was there. That was all it was. But in the specific darkness of those 4 days, that was not a small thing. On the third night, the pain peaked. I thrashed against the sheets, and I grabbed for the nearest thing, and the nearest thing was his hand, because at some point he had come to sit in the chair beside the bed, close enough to reach, and I dug my nails into his palm, and I heard myself say things I would not have said if I had been able to think clearly. Make it stop. Please, just let me die. I am so tired. Please. He did not pull away. He leaned forward, and I felt the mattress shift under his weight, and he pressed his forehead to mine. Very carefully, very deliberately. And he opened something. Some internal door that I had not known existed, and through the bond that had been forming between us since the parking lot, something flowed, cool and dark and enormous, the strength of something ancient and absolute, his wolf wrapping around mine in the dark. I cannot take the pain away, he said, very quietly, very close, but I can be here. Not I will save you, not I will fix this, just I can be here. I held onto his hand, and I breathed, and his wolf held mine in the dark, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, the fever broke. I woke to sunlight, real sunlight, the specific amber of a Pacific Northwest morning when the sky has cleared overnight and the light comes through at an angle that makes everything sharp and golden. I lay still, and I took inventory. No fever. No bone pain, no fog. My head was clear in a way it had not been in 3 years. A clarity so complete it felt almost aggressive, like stepping from a dim room into full daylight. The forest was a mile away through the window. I could smell the individual trees. Caden was asleep in the chair. He was not a graceful sleeper. He was too large for the chair, one arm propped on the armrest and his head resting on his hand, and his face in sleep was different from his face awake. The severity eased, the lines of it gentler, the scar along his jaw less a marking of violence and more simply a line on a face that was trying, even in sleep, to tell the truth about itself. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been awake for 4 days in a chair beside a sick woman because there was nowhere else he was going to be. I sat up slowly. "You are staring," he said, without opening his eyes. "You were drooling," I said. He opened one eye. There it was again, that shadow of a smile, brief and entirely real. "I do not drool. I was brooding majestically. In a chair, while asleep. The most efficient kind of brooding." He sat up, stretching, and I heard the protest of joints that had spent the night folded into a space too small for them. He looked at me with the sharp, assessing quality that I was beginning to understand was not suspicion but care expressed through attention. "How do you feel?" I considered the question honestly. "Hungry," I said, "and angry." Something settled in his face. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more complete. "Good," he said. "Anger is useful. We begin training this afternoon." He stood and walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at me. And there was something in the look that I was not ready to name yet, but that I filed carefully away. The way you file something you know you will need later. "Mara," he said. I looked at him. "Welcome back." He left. And I sat in the sunlight with my clear head and my angry heart, and my eyes that I knew, without looking at a mirror, were burning violet. And for the first time in 3 years, I thought, I am not broken. I never was. The training began that same afternoon, and it was nothing like I expected. I had imagined something ceremonial, perhaps. A formal introduction to weapons or technique, the kind of structured lesson that announces itself as important. What I got instead was Caden Ashvale standing in the center of a room that had been cleared of furniture, wearing dark training clothes, looking at me with the particular patience of someone who has decided not to waste either of their time. "Hit me," he said. I looked at him. I have never thrown a punch in my life. "I know. Hit me anyway." I hit him. It was terrible. My form was wrong. My weight was in the wrong place, and my fist connected with his forearm at an angle that sent the impact straight up into my wrist instead of into him. He did not move. He looked at where I had struck, and then looked at me. "Again," he said. We did this for 2 hours. By the end of it, I had a bruised wrist, an elevated heart rate, and the beginning of an understanding of something Caden had said quietly while repositioning my stance for the 4th time. His hands on my hips, with the careful precision of someone adjusting a mechanism rather than touching a person, except that the warmth of it moved through the fabric of my training clothes and settled somewhere I did not examine too closely. "Brennan Voss is a brawler," he had said, not looking at me but at the line of my shoulders, correcting the angle. "He relies on mass and aggression. He expects resistance to come from the same direction as his force. You will not give him that. You are faster than he is. You are more precise. You hit where he is not braced. And you hit once, and you make it count." He stepped back. Again. That was day 8. By day 14, I had stopped telegraphing my movements. By day 18, I blocked a strike from Caden that he had not, I was fairly certain, intended me to block. He stopped, looked at his forearm, looked at me, said nothing. But the quality of his silence was different from the silence before, and I understood, without needing it translated, that something had shifted in his assessment of me. Good, I thought. Keep shifting. The nights were different from the days. During the days I was a student, a body learning to become a weapon, a woman rebuilding herself from the architecture inward. During the nights, the palace was quiet in the specific way of large buildings that are never fully at rest, and I would lie in the enormous bed in the East Wing suite, and I would listen to the forest, and I would think. I thought about the training, about the way Caden moved, economical and precise, never more force than the situation required, never less certainty than the moment demanded. I thought about the chair beside my bed and the 4 nights he had sat in it without being asked. I thought about his wolf, the one I had felt in the dark on the 3rd night of the fever, that enormous cool darkness wrapping around the small frightened thing inside me. I thought about what it meant that I had not been frightened of it. I thought about Brennan less than I expected to. When I did think about him, it was not with the hot grief I had anticipated. It was something quieter and more specific. The grief of understanding that a person you loved was never quite the person you loved them as. That somewhere in 3 years of ordinary mornings and ordinary kindnesses and ordinary small betrayals, you had been loving a version of someone that his own choices had been steadily disproving. That grief was real. I did not pretend it was not. But I was done living inside it. The night of the full moon came on day 21, 4 days before the winter solstice ball. Caden took me to the royal hunting grounds after dark. The forest at night was a different thing from the forest in daylight, older and less interested in being observed. The trees enormous and indifferent, and smelling of cold pine and old earth and snow that had been on the ground long enough to become part of the landscape rather than weather. My breath came white in the air. I was wearing thermal layers under a heavy coat, and my feet were warm in proper boots for the first time since the parking lot, and I felt, walking into those trees with Caden a half step beside me, something I did not have a word for at 24, but recognized instinctively. Ready? He stopped at a small clearing where the moonlight came through unobstructed, a circle of silver on snow. "She is waiting," he said. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the tree line, giving me privacy in some way I understood without having it explained. "I cannot do this for you. I would not, even if I could. This belongs to you." I closed my eyes. I had tried this before. 3 years ago, in the first months of my marriage, before the injections had accumulated to the point of total suppression, I had stood in the Voss Estate's back garden on a full moon night and tried to find the shift and felt nothing. A blankness where something was supposed to be, like reaching for a door handle in the dark and finding only wall. I had assumed that blankness was me. I had assumed it was proof of what the doctor said, that I was deficient, that something fundamental was absent. Now I knew the blankness had a source. Now I knew what had been put between me and myself, and by whom, and why. I went inward, past the training-tired surface of my muscles, past the careful composure I had been wearing like armor for 3 weeks, past the anger, which was still there and still useful, but did not need to be in the front right now, deeper into the place where the violet light came from, the place I had seen in mirrors and not known how to reach. And there she was. She had always been there. That was what I understood. In the moment I found her, she had not been absent. She had been held down, suppressed, reduced to the smallest possible version of herself by 3 years of poison, administered by a man who smelled of antiseptic and deliberate lies. But she had not been destroyed. She had simply been waiting, with the patient certainty of something that knows it cannot be permanently stopped. She opened her eyes. They were violet. Of course they were. The shift happened the way falling asleep happens, all at once after a long time of almost. One moment I was Mara in the snow in thermal layers, and the next moment I was something else entirely. Something low to the ground and enormously present and overwhelmingly awake, breathing air that tasted of ice and pine resin and the faint musk of a dozen animals in the dark forest who had just registered my existence and were making rapid decisions about their proximity to it. I was white. I knew this the way you know things about your own body without looking. From the inside out, white as new snow, white as something that has no interest in camouflage because it does not need to hide from anything. Caden shifted beside me. His wolf was what I had felt in the dark during the fever, made visible, massive, black as the space between stars, with amber eyes that were recognizably his. That same quality of clear, steady attention. He towered over me in wolf form by a full head and a significant amount of mass. He stood very still, looking at me, and then he did something I did not expect. He lowered his head, a slight bow, contained, dignified, the gesture of something ancient acknowledging something it recognizes as its equal or its better. The Alpha King's wolf, bowing to mine. I filed that away as well. Then he lifted his head, and something in his posture shifted from ceremonial to playful, just slightly, just enough, a nudge of his enormous black muzzle against my shoulder. And we ran. I will not try to translate that into anything it is not. There is no adequate language for what it felt like to run in the body I had been denied for 3 years, to feel the snow under my paws, and the cold air moving through fur that was apparently mine, and had apparently always been mine, to be fast in a way that felt like remembering rather than learning. We ran through the old forest under the full moon, black and white, his mass and my speed. And for the first time in 24 years, I was completely, entirely, without reservation or asterisk, myself. When we shifted back and collapsed onto the frozen moss, breathing hard, his coat already around my shoulders before I had fully registered the cold, I was laughing. A real laugh. Unplanned, the kind that comes from somewhere below decision. I had not heard myself make that sound in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it as mine. He was smiling. The full version, the one that took his entire face. And I understood that it was rare, and that I was one of very few people who had seen it, and that both of those things were significant. 4 days, he said, still catching his breath. We have 4 days before the ball. I leaned back against the trunk of a fir tree and looked up at the moon and let the cold air cool the heat of the shift on my skin. I know. Mara. I looked at him. He was sitting on the moss a few feet from me, forearms on his knees, looking at me with the expression he had developed over 3 weeks that I had come to think of as his honest face. The one that did not manage itself. There is something I should have told you sooner, he said. The cold came back slightly, not the weather, the internal kind. Tell me now. Ren confirmed the pregnancy on the 3rd day of your detox, when enough of the suppressant had cleared to allow an accurate result. He held my gaze. He did not look away from whatever he found there. The child is already drawing on your energy. It is significant because of what the child carries, the combined inheritance of both bloodlines. It will increase as the pregnancy progresses. He paused. There is a place, Moonstone Shrine, 3 hours from here, deep in the old growth. It sits on a ley line of natural energy, pure and very old. If you can reach it and draw from it, the child will feed from the land rather than from your core. It will stabilize you both. He paused again. I intended to tell you after the ball. I was concerned that the information would. Overwhelm me, I said. Yes. I sat with that for a moment. The moon was exactly where it had been. The forest was exactly as it had been. Everything was the same, and everything was different in the specific way that new information reorganizes the landscape of everything you were already standing in. Were you wrong to wait? I asked. He considered it honestly, which I had come to understand was the only way he considered things. Yes, he said. It was my assessment of your capacity, not yours. I should have given you the information and trusted you with it. I nodded, slowly. After the ball, I said, we go to the shrine after the ball. I walk into that ballroom on my own terms and I finish what I need to finish with Graydon Voss. And then we go. I looked at him. Together. Something passed through his expression that I still did not have complete language for. Together, he said. We sat in the moonlit clearing in the silence that had developed between us over 3 weeks, the particular silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill space with words, and I placed my hand on my abdomen, gently, where nothing was yet visible, but something was unmistakably present. A child made of 2 old bloodlines, fed by the land itself, not a liability, a dynasty. Then, on the morning of day 22, the intelligence report arrived. I was in the East Wing training room working through the sequence Caden had given me, moving through it slowly and precisely, finding the rhythm of it, when I heard his voice in the corridor outside change register. Not louder, quieter. The specific quiet that in 3 weeks I had learned meant something had gone wrong. He came in holding a single sheet of paper. The remnants of Silver Creek, he said, using the term for a dispersed pack's remnants, have been tracked moving along the northern edge of the Moonstone Approach Road. They are not traveling randomly. They know the route. He set the paper on the table. Someone in this household gave them the itinerary. I looked at the paper, at the route marked in red, at the notation of timing in the margin, the hour of departure, the number of vehicles, the medical designation of the 3rd car, all of it, everything. Isolde Farron, I said. He shook his head. Isolde does not have contacts inside the palace. This signature is older than she is. He paused. The name on the order is someone who knew your parents. Someone who has been tracking the White Wolf bloodline since before you were born. He did not tell me the name. Not yet. I understood, from the way he held it, that he needed to be certain before he said it aloud, that saying it aloud would be a detonation of something he could not take back. I looked at the marked route on the paper, at the timing notation in the margin, at the medical designation of the 3rd car, which told whoever was reading it exactly where I would be sitting and exactly how protected I would not be. "They are not coming for Graydon," I said. "No. They are coming for the child." He held my gaze. "Yes." Outside the window, the Pacific Northwest morning was pale and gold and entirely indifferent to us, the way mornings always are when the thing they are dawning on is more than they can be expected to account for. 4 days until the winter solstice ball. 4 days until I walked into a room full of wolves who had known me as a transaction, a clear debt, a null, and showed them what 3 years of poison could not kill. 4 days, and somewhere on the road between the palace and the oldest place of power in the territory, something was waiting for us that knew my name before I knew it myself. I picked up the paper, I read the route again, I set it down. "Then we prepare for both," I said. The night of the winter solstice ball arrived the way significant nights always arrive, without ceremony, without the world pausing to acknowledge what it is carrying. I woke at 5 in the morning to frost on the eastern windows and a stillness in the palace that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. The kind of stillness that precedes something irreversible. I lay in the dark for a few minutes and I took inventory of myself the way Caden had taught me to take inventory before training. Not emotionally. Physically first, then everything else. My body was clear. The last traces of the wolf's bane had been gone for over a week, and I had been living in the absence of it long enough now to understand how thoroughly it had been rewriting me. How the fog and the cold and the dull, persistent ache I had accepted as simply the texture of my existence had all been manufactured, imposed, gone now. I was 24 years old, and I was healthy, and my wolf was awake and burning violet behind my eyes. And somewhere in my body, very small and very fierce, something was growing that carried the oldest blood on the continent. I got up. I did not call for the staff. I had asked them the night before to leave everything I needed in the dressing room and to give me the morning. I wanted to do this alone, not because I was performing solitude for some imagined audience, but because this particular preparation felt like something that belonged to me, the last private act of the woman I had been before tonight, before I walked through a set of doors and became something that could not be undone. The gown was silver. I had not chosen it. Caden had sent it without note or explanation 4 days ago, a long flat box left on the vanity table in my suite, and when I opened it, I had stood very still for a long moment looking at what was inside. It was not a statement gown in the way that some formal wear announces itself, loud and deliberate. It was quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. The fabric moved like liquid metal, catching light and releasing it in ways that suggested fire without imitating it. The back was open to the base of my spine. The neckline was simple. There was no ornamentation except the structure of the thing itself, which was enough, which was more than enough, because the structure said everything that needed to be said without saying it loudly. I put it on alone. I did my own hair, gathering it back at first and then releasing it, because the woman who wore her hair pulled tightly back was the woman from the parking lot, and I was not her anymore. I let it fall in waves over one shoulder. I did my makeup with the precision of someone who has been trained to notice where force should be applied and where restraint serves better. Sharp at the eyes, clean everywhere else. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were violet, not faintly, not with the suggestion of violet that I had seen in the first days of my recovery. Fully, unmistakably violet. the color of something that has been dormant for a long time and is no longer interested in being subtle about its return. I picked up the small silver pin from the vanity. The silver wolf's head, old enough to have worn smooth at the edges, old enough to carry the particular weight of something that has been held by many hands. Caden's grandmother had worn it, he had told me, and his grandmother's mother before that. And it had sat in a box for decades, waiting for someone whose hair it was made to be placed in. I pressed it into my hair. There was a knock at the door. Caden stood in the corridor in a midnight blue velvet tuxedo, the lapels dark satin, a crown of simple black obsidian that he wore the way he wore everything without effort, as if the weight of it had never required his acknowledgement. He looked at me. He did not say anything for a moment. "Ready?" he said finally. "I have been ready for 3 years," I said. They just did not know it. Something moved across his face, brief and complete. He offered his arm. I took it. The warmth of his forearm beneath my fingers was steady and unhurried, the particular warmth of someone whose body has decided to be calm, so that yours does not have to work as hard at it. We walked toward the ballroom together. The doors were closed when we reached them. On the other side, I could hear 500 wolves, the low collective sound of a large formal gathering, the clink of crystal and the undercurrent of conversation, and the specific frequency of dominant wolves in a confined space negotiating hierarchy without appearing to. I could smell them through the doors. Every pack in the region, every alpha who owed allegiance to the crown, including the ones who had sold me for a cleared ledger. The herald stepped forward, staff raised, and looked at Caden, who gave a single nod, and the staff came down against the marble floor with a sound that rang through the stone like a struck bell. The doors opened. The music stopped. 500 wolves turned toward the entrance simultaneously, and the silence that replaced the music was a different kind of silence from the ordinary absence of sound. It was the silence of collective attention, of an entire room holding the same breath. "All hail, His Majesty, King Caden Ashvale," the herald's voice rang out. "Alpha of alphas, sovereign of all territories, north, south, east, and west." The wave of submission moved through the room like wind through tall grass. Every wolf bent, every alpha inclined their head. The hierarchy made physical and visible, as it always was in the presence of the king. From where I stood at the top of the stairs, I could see all of it, the bowed heads, the lowered eyes, the instinctive yielding of every dominant wolf in the room to the one who stood above them. I could see 3 people near the buffet table who did not yet understand what was about to happen. Graydon Voss in his good coat with the brass buttons. Brennan beside him in a tuxedo, his sandy hair neat, his jaw tight, his eyes moving constantly around the room with the restlessness of a man who has been unable to sleep for weeks. And on Brennan's arm, in a red dress cut low enough to be a statement, a diamond ring on her left hand large enough to be a conversation, Isolde Farron. The herald's voice came again, slightly different in register, the careful neutrality of someone reporting something unprecedented. "All hail Her Majesty, the White Wolf, the Queen." The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something more involuntary than that. A collective intake of breath, a sound made by 500 individual bodies, all receiving the same impossible information simultaneously, and none of them having a prepared response for it. A queen. Caden Ashvale had never taken a queen. A gloved hand took mine. I stepped into the light. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk down those stairs, but I want to be precise about it rather than romantic. It did not feel triumphant. It did not feel like victory, not yet, because victory has a specific texture. And this was not that texture. What it felt like was correct, as if after years of being in the wrong room, wearing the wrong name, breathing air that had been slightly the wrong composition, I had finally, at the top of a marble staircase, in a gown the color of moonlight, arrived in the exact location I was supposed to occupy. I did not look down. I did not look nervous. I looked at the room with the calm of someone who has already decided how this evening ends and is simply allowing events to confirm it. We descended together, step by step, perfectly synchronized. The crowd parted below us without being asked. An involuntary yielding, bodies moving aside in the presence of the bond scent that moved between Caden and me like a current. I had noticed it increasingly over the past week, the way the mating bond deepened with each day, the way his scent and mine had begun to layer together into something that was neither wholly his nor wholly mine, but something third and unmistakable. Every wolf in the room could smell it. We reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd had opened into a corridor of space that led directly to where the Silver Creek delegation stood near the far wall. And I walked through it without pause, without hurry, without giving anyone in the room the impression that I had a destination other than the one I had chosen. I stopped in front of Graydon Voss. He was already trembling. I could smell the sour particular scent of his fear underneath the expensive cologne, underneath the scotch on his breath. The biological truth of a dominant wolf who has just understood that the hierarchy has reorganized itself in a way he did not account for and cannot reverse. I looked at the shattered champagne glass at his feet. "Hello, Alpha Voss," I said. My voice was entirely conversational, the tone of someone running into a mild acquaintance at a routine function. "I believe you dropped something." The silence in the room was absolute. Graydon's mouth moved. Nothing came out. Whatever he had prepared for tonight, whatever internal script he had been running for the past 3 weeks since the parking lot, it had not included this. It could not have included this, because this was not a version of me he had ever allowed to exist in his calculations. The version of me in his calculations was gray and thin and silent and broken. That version was gone. Brennan stepped forward. He looked terrible, actually. Not physically. He was still the same conventionally handsome man with the sandy hair and the jaw that photographed well. But there was something underneath it that had caved in, some structural certainty that had been load-bearing and was now absent. His eyes were red-rimmed. His shoulders were slightly wrong. The carriage of a man whose wolf had been trying to tell him something for weeks that he had been refusing to hear. "Mara," he said, and his voice broke on the second syllable. "You are the queen." Caden moved to stand behind me, his hand settling on the bare skin of my lower back, the warmth of it specific and deliberate, and entirely my choice to accept. "Queen Mara," Caden said, and his voice was low and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "And you are the man who signed the paperwork to sell her for a gambling debt." The whispers broke across the room like a wave breaking across rock. I had not planned what I was going to say next, not the exact words. I had trusted that when I was standing here, in this room, with the people who had done what they had done to me, I would know what needed to be said. That trust had not been misplaced. I took one step forward, closing the remaining distance between myself and Graydon, and I addressed the room, not loudly, clearly. "I want to tell you something," I said, "that every alpha in this room should hear, because it concerns the integrity of pack medicine and the safety of every female wolf in every territory you govern." I paused. I was not Barren. I was poisoned. Wolf's Bane, concentrated and pharmaceutical grade, administered by injection once a week for 3 years by Dr. Stellan Prent of the Silver Creek Pack, under the direct order of Alpha Graydon Voss. I let that sit in the room for exactly 3 seconds. The purpose was to suppress my wolf and prevent conception, because the blood I carry, the bloodline of the pure white wolf, was considered a threat to the Voss family's dominance of the Southern Territory. They did not want me dead. Dead wolves are investigated. They wanted me manageable, suppressed, useful until I was not, and then dispensable. The sound that moved through the room was not a whisper this time. It was something lower and more collective, the sound of 500 wolves processing the same moral violation simultaneously. "And as of this morning," I continued, and I placed my hand on my abdomen, flat and deliberate, "the royal physician has confirmed that the king's heir is growing exactly as it should." The room detonated, not literally, but the sound of it was not far from that, the controlled explosion of collective shock in a space with excellent acoustics. And in the center of it, Graydon Voss looked at me with an expression that moved through several stages very quickly: disbelief, calculation, and then, underneath everything else, a raw and ugly panic. "She is lying," he said. His voice had lost its steadiness. "She is a liar and a fraud, and whatever she has told this court is manufactured to embarrass this pack, and I will not stand here, and—" He shifted. I want to be precise about this too. He shifted in the middle of his own sentence, between fraud and this, the control failing so completely that the human form simply gave way. The gray wolf he became was large and fast and aimed directly at my throat. Caden moved behind me, but I was faster. I raised my hand. I did not think about it. I did not decide to do it in any conscious way. The wolf inside me, awake and fully present for the first time in 3 years, assessed the threat and responded. And what came from my palm was not something I had practiced in the training room, because it was not something that could be practiced. It was older than training. It was older than technique. It was the defensive magic of a bloodline that had survived being hunted for 3 generations by being exactly what was needed at exactly the moment it was needed. White and violet, a wave of force that expanded from my hand like a shockwave. It struck Graydon's wolf mid-lunge, and he flew. Not gently. He crossed the full width of the ballroom and struck the buffet table with a sound that was part crash and part silence. The silence being the moment before everything that had been on the table finished landing on the floor around him. He did not get up immediately. I lowered my hand. 500 wolves were completely still. I looked at the space where Graydon had been standing, and then looked at the royal guards who were already moving, silver-tipped spears crossing at his throat as he tried to rise from the wreckage of the table. I looked at the warlock who served the king's court, already stepping forward from his position near the wall, the ceremonial iron in his hands glowing with the particular light of bound runes. I turned to Brennan. He was on his knees. I do not think he had decided to kneel. I think his legs had simply made the decision independently, the way a wolf's body bypasses intention when the hierarchy becomes clear enough. He was crying. Real tears, the ugly, unself-conscious kind, running down the face of a man who had just watched the full consequence of his choices arrive in a ballroom in silver and violet. "Mara," he choked out. "Please, I did not know about the poison. I swear to you, I did not know how bad it was. I was doing what my father told me. I thought I was protecting the pack. I thought—" "You thought," I said, walking around him slowly, "that you were making a practical decision, that the benefits outweighed the person." I stopped in front of him. "You drove me to 47 appointments with a man who was poisoning me. You held my hand while he did it. You never asked to see the results. You never asked why I was always tired, always cold, always slightly less than I had been the week before." I crouched down so we were level, which required more physical steadiness than it appeared to. "You did not love me, Brennan. You loved that I was quiet. You loved that I did not take up too much space. You loved that I had nowhere else to go and no one to go to." I held his gaze. "But I was never the thing you told yourself I was. And somewhere in you, some part of you has always known that. Which is why you cannot sleep. Which is why your wolf has been silent for 3 weeks." I stood. "I am not going to tell you I forgive you. I am not there yet, and I may never be, and that is my right. What I will tell you is that I am done. Completely, entirely, finally done. Whatever we were to each other, it is over, and I release both of us from it." I turned away. "Strip them of their alpha command," I said to the room, to the council members standing in the front row, to the old wolf named Thorn, who served as head of the regional council and who had been watching me with an expression of utter stillness since I had raised my hand. "Bind their wolves. Banish them to the rogue lands. Not death. Death is too easy, and I am not a butcher. I am a queen. Let them live in the world they chose, without the power they used to make those choices." Thorn bowed. Caden had already sent the order 2 hours before the ball began. He had told Mara nothing about it because it was not her burden to carry into the ballroom. The warlock stepped forward. Brennan screamed when the iron touched his shoulder, a raw sound with no dignity in it, and Graydon thrashed against the guards holding him and said things that I did not listen to, because they were the things that men say when the world has finally organized itself honestly around them, and they are experiencing that honesty as injustice. I watched. I did not look away. I had promised myself in the bathroom at 4 a.m. that I would not flinch tonight, and I kept that promise through to the end, through the smoke and the sound and the finality of it, and when it was done, and the guards were dragging them from the ballroom, leaving trails on the marble that the staff would clean in the morning, I felt what I had expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not pleasure, not the hot release of revenge that people describe like a drug. Just the end of something. The clean, specific sensation of a wound that has been properly closed. Isolde Farron had been silent throughout all of it, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. And now she looked around at the room, at the other women who had been her social allies. The Lunas and Alpha daughters who had laughed at her jokes about the Barren Voss wife at every gala for 3 years, and found that they had turned away. Not dramatically, simply turned, the way people turn when they have calculated their proximity to a falling thing and decided the distance. "My father," Isolde said, and her voice had lost its performance, was simply a frightened young woman's voice now. My father has resources, political connections. He is building half the technology infrastructure in the region. You need him. You cannot simply... Your father, Caden said, is currently being escorted from his estate by my personal guard on charges of financial conspiracy with the Voss family. His voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been, "You have no money, Isolde. No status. No pack. Whatever you came here tonight intending to become, it is no longer available." He paused. "You will be escorted from the premises. What happens next depends entirely on what you choose to do with the next few hours." Isolde looked at me. I looked back at her without animosity. She was 26 years old, and she had made choices that were small and mean and short-sighted, and she was going to spend a long time living in the consequences of them. That was not nothing, but it was also not mine to carry. "Go," I said. Simply that. She went. The doors closed behind her, and the room was still for exactly 3 seconds. And then Thorne, from his position at the front of the council row, bowed again, deeply, and said, "The Silver Creek Pack is hereby dissolved. Their lands are seized and will be redistributed to neighboring territories at the Crown's discretion. The charges of high treason against the royal bloodline are confirmed." Around the room, one by one and then in clusters, the Alphas and Lunas began to bow. Not the formal bow of the entrance, the performative hierarchy acknowledgement. Something different, something that came from lower down in the body, from the place where wolves understand power not as position, but as truth. Caden's hand came to my back again, warm and steady and present. "The orchestra," he said quietly, to no one in particular, and the musicians, who had been sitting frozen at their instruments for the last 15 minutes, startled back into awareness and began to play. A waltz, slow and haunting, the kind of music that acknowledges everything it is moving through. Caden turned to me. "My wife wishes to dance," he said. That was the first time he had used that word. Not queen, not mate, wife. A smaller word, and therefore a larger one. The intimate rather than the formal, the private rather than the public. I took his hand. We moved across the floor together, across the marble where Graydon's gray wolf had been dragged, across the space where Brennan had knelt, through the center of 500 wolves who parted for us, and then, gradually, began to fill in behind us, other couples joining the waltz, the room resuming itself around the fact of what had just happened with the particular resilience of people who have decided to move forward. I rested my head against Caden's chest. His heartbeat was slow and certain beneath my ear, the same rhythm I had first heard in the parking lot, the one that had matched itself to mine. I placed my hand flat against his chest, over that rhythm. "You were terrified," he said, very quietly, his lips near my hair. "Completely," I agreed. "You did not show it." "I know. I practiced not showing it for 3 years. Graydon's household was very good training for that particular skill." His chest moved with a low sound that was almost a laugh. "And now?" I considered the question seriously, the way I was trying to consider all questions seriously now, with the full weight of a mind that was no longer operating through 3 years of fog. "Now," I said, "I think I would like to go to the shrine, as soon as the dance is finished." His arm tightened slightly around my waist, not pulling me closer, just acknowledging, A small gravity between two things that have decided to remain in each other's orbit. We danced. Around us, the room was full of sound and movement, and the particular electricity of people who had witnessed something they would be describing for the rest of their lives. I could hear fragments of it at the edges of the waltz, the whispered reconstructions already beginning, the way the story was already arranging itself into the version that would be told later. The Barren Luna, the White Wolf, the king who stopped pacing. Let them tell it, I thought. The story is mine. They are just the witnesses. The dance ended. We moved through the room toward the exit, accepting acknowledgments from alphas who bowed slightly as we passed, and I held Caden's arm and I breathed in the mingled scent of 500 wolves and expensive champagne and the cold Pacific Northwest air coming through the high windows, and I thought about a 4-year-old girl who had been sat down by a social worker in a beige office and told that her parents were not coming back, and how that girl had spent the next 20 years quietly, persistently, without any particular drama, refusing to disappear. She had been right to refuse. The convoy assembled within the hour. 4 armored vehicles, full royal guard, the medical transport in the center with its equipment, and Dr. Ren Calloway and the monitors that measured everything measurable about what was happening in my body. Caden and I rode in the medical transport, which he had refused to alter. He sat beside me, not across from me as he had in the limousine 4 weeks ago, but beside me, his shoulder against mine, his hand over mine on the seat between us. The road into the old forest was narrow and unlit, the headlights of the convoy cutting white paths through trees that closed overhead like a cathedral. I watched the forest move past the window, and I felt the energy of the shrine before I could name it, a low hum at the base of my spine, the particular resonance of a place that has been holding power in the earth for longer than any structure built by people. "Can you feel it?" Caden asked. "Yes." "Half an hour," he said. I nodded and leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes and let the hum build. And beneath my hand, I felt the flutter of something small and incandescent that was not my heartbeat. And I thought, we are almost there. We are almost safe. We have done the hard part. Then the lead vehicle exploded. The shockwave hit our transport like a wall, lifting the rear wheels, and Caden was over me before I had fully processed the sound, his body braced between me and the forward wall, as the vehicle came down hard on all 4 wheels and skidded sideways across the road surface and stopped. Over the ringing in my ears, I heard the radio. "Ambush! Hostiles in the tree line. They have..." The radio cut out. Caden lifted his head. His eyes had gone fully gold. The shift pushing at the surface. The king submerged by something older and more direct. He looked at me, at the monitors, at the specific readout that Ren had told him to watch. "Stay," he said. Not a command, a request. The difference was audible. He looked at the 2 guards in the transport with us. "Your lives," he said, "and nothing else." And they understood. He kicked the rear doors open and leaped into the dark. The road outside was lit by the burning wreckage of the lead vehicle. And in that firelight, I could see figures moving out of the trees with the particular coordination of wolves who have been trained together, who have fought together, who have nothing left to lose. Silver Creek remnants, ragged and hungry and burning with the specific ferocity of people who have been told they have been wronged and have had months in the rogue lands to let that story calcify into something harder than reason. And on the hood of a Jeep that sat crosswise blocking the road, lit from below by the burning wreck, was Isolde Farron. She had not gone. She had driven directly from the ballroom to wherever this had been staged, and she was standing on the hood of that Jeep in her red dress and her ruined hair, and she was holding a canister in both hands with the particular careful grip of someone who is frightened of the thing they are holding and has decided that the fear is no longer relevant. Through the window, I watched Caden shift, his massive black wolf tearing through the first line of attackers with a focused efficiency that was both terrible and completely without hesitation. But there were too many of them, and they had planned for him, and within 2 minutes he was engaged on 3 sides, held in place by bodies that were willing to absorb damage in order to keep him from reaching the transport. The rear doors of the transport were open where he had kicked them. Isolde looked directly at me through the gap. "If I cannot have it," she said, and her voice carried clearly in the cold air, "then none of it exists." She pulled the pin. The canister left her hand in a clean arc, end over end, moving toward the open rear doors of the transport with the unhurried certainty of physics, and I had exactly enough time to see it, to track its trajectory, to understand what it would do when it arrived. Ren made a sound. One of the guards lunged. I was faster than both of them. Not with my body. My body was exactly where it was, sitting in the transport, one hand braced against the seat and one hand flat against my abdomen. I did not move. I reached inward, past the training and the anger and the wolf who was awake and ready, deeper than all of that, to the small, fierce brightness that had been drawing on my energy for weeks. I asked it nothing. I simply opened. What came out of me was not something I had been taught. It was not something that had a name in any training manual or pack tradition I had encountered. It was the specific response of 2 very old bloodlines meeting in a single body and recognizing that what was being threatened was the continuation of both of them, and deciding, with a unanimity that required no deliberation, that this was not acceptable. The wave of energy that erupted from my body was violet and gold simultaneously. It hit the canister 6 feet from the transport doors. The detonation was outward, away from us, a contained explosion that expanded in every direction except toward the vehicle, the shock wave rolling out across the road and the tree line and the burning wreck and every living thing within 30 meters. The guards were thrown to the transport floor. Every wolf on the road, Caden's guards and Silver Creek remnants alike, dropped to their knees as the aura hit them, an involuntary submission response to something they could not fight because it was not attacking them. It was simply being what it was, which was more than enough. Isolde struck the tree line 20 feet behind her Jeep and did not move after that. And then, in the ringing silence that followed, inside the transport, there was a sound, small, outraged, completely certain of its own right to exist. I looked down. Ren was already there, her hands steady despite everything, and she looked up at me with an expression that mixed professional focus with something more personal and said, "He is here." I held him. He was not what newborns look like in the photographs, red-faced and uncertain and compressed by the journey into the world. He was what he was from the first moment, which was himself, entirely and without apology. He opened his eyes almost immediately, and one was the amber of his father's wolf, the warm liquid gold that I had first seen in a freezing parking lot and had been learning the depths of ever since. The other was violet, Caden came through the transport doors with blood on his chest and his suit destroyed beyond salvage, and his eyes still partially shifted, and he stopped. He stopped completely. "Ren," I said, because she was the only other person in the transport whose name I knew. "I think his father needs a moment." Caden crossed the space between the doors and the seat where I was sitting, and he went to his knees on the transport floor, which was not clean and was not ceremonial and was exactly right. He reached out one finger, trembling slightly, which was the only time I had ever seen him tremble, and touched the small, clenched fist of his son. The fist opened, the fingers, impossibly small, wrapped around his. Caden made a sound that I am not going to describe because it belongs to him, and he looked at his son, and then he looked at me, and whatever I had seen in his face before, the recognition, the patience, the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had been waiting for 10 years and had finally arrived, all of it was present, and something more was present underneath it. Something that had not been there before, because it had not yet had a reason to exist. "He protected us," I said, "before he was born." Outside, the surviving Silver Creek wolves were prostrate on the road, faces down, necks exposed, not surrendering to Caden's guards, surrendering to the aura still radiating from the transport, the combined inheritance of both bloodlines announcing itself to the world for the first time. I held my son in the wreckage of an ambush on a mountain road in the Pacific Northwest, and I listened to his first sounds, and I thought about a gray dress and a parking lot and the specific temperature of being sold by the people who were supposed to protect you. I thought about how that night, which had felt like the end of my story, had been the first line of an entirely different one. In the pocket of Isolde Farron's red dress, which a guard would find 20 minutes later when the medics reached her at the base of the tree, there was a folded piece of paper, a name, an instruction, a signature that Caden would look at in the pale pre-dawn light and recognize, and whose recognition would change the color of the silence between us for the rest of that long night. But that was later. Right now, there was only this: my son, his father's finger in his fist. The forest around us, old and indifferent and smelling of pine and cold, and the particular ozone sweetness of very old power disturbed from its resting place. And somewhere ahead of us on the road, still waiting, the shrine. Spring came to the royal territory the way spring comes to the Pacific Northwest, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, as if the land had simply decided it was finished with winter and was not interested in a transition period. One morning the frost was on the windows, and the next morning it was not. And in its place was the particular green of new growth in the old forest, the kind of green that has no equivalent in anything made by human hands, too saturated, too alive, too unapologetically itself. I was sitting in the garden when I noticed it had happened. The stone bench was warm under my palms, the granite holding heat the way old stone does, slowly and thoroughly. And the apple tree at the garden's eastern edge had broken into blossom overnight, white flowers against new leaves, and the air smelled of pine from the forest below, and something sweeter that I had learned over the past year to associate specifically with this garden at this time of day, the late afternoon light coming through the trees at an angle that turned everything gold. Riven was in the grass. He was 12 months old and the size of a 3-year-old human child, and he had been walking since he was 9 months old, which had alarmed the household staff considerably, and which Wren had documented with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood she was recording something that would be referenced for a very long time. He was currently pursuing a butterfly with the focused intensity of a predator who has not yet fully understood that the gap between intention and execution requires practice, lurching forward on legs that were steadier than they had any right to be. His arms extended, his expression one of absolute conviction. The butterfly ascended. Riven stopped, looked up, looked at his hands, and then, from the center of his left palm, a small pulse of light escaped, violet and gold, no larger than a spark, drifting upward in the direction the butterfly had gone. He watched it go, satisfied, as if this was a reasonable substitute for the thing he had been trying to catch. "He is going to be completely ungovernable," Caden said, sitting down beside me. He had come from the Eastern study. I could tell from the slight tension still in his shoulders that meant he had been reviewing something difficult, and he was carrying 2 cups. One of which he placed in my hands with the wordless efficiency of someone who has learned, over the course of a year of shared mornings, exactly what the person beside him needs before they know to ask for it. I wrapped both hands around the cup. "He gets the stubbornness from you," I said. "He gets the capacity for independent action from you." "That is the same thing said more diplomatically." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes." We sat together in the kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough comfort to not need to say them. I had not known, before this year, that this kind of quiet existed. I had known the quiet of a house where you stopped talking because talking invited correction. I had known the quiet of a hospital waiting room and the quiet of a car when you have been told something you cannot yet process. I had not known the quiet of 2 people sitting in a garden watching their son chase light with his bare hands and not needing to make it into anything other than what it was. I looked at my wrist. The scar was faint now, almost invisible in the spring light. A slight variation in the texture of my skin where the injection sites had been. 47 visits. 47 rounds of something that was supposed to erase me, administered with such consistency and such deliberation that for 3 years I had accepted the erasure as my own nature. Caden's thumb moved across it. He did not say anything. He had stopped saying things about the scar months ago because we had said everything there was to say about it, and what remained was not something that needed words. His thumb moved across it, and I let him, and we watched Riven discover that the garden contained more than one butterfly, and respond to this information with what could only be described as strategic reassessment. "I used to think about her sometimes," I said. "The girl in the parking lot." Caden was quiet, listening. He had learned over the course of this year that when I began a sentence this way, I did not need a response to the first part. I needed someone to be present for the rest of it. I used to think about what I would say to her, if I could go back. I turned the cup in my hands. I think I used to want to warn her, to tell her what was coming, so she could prepare. So she would not have to be blindsided by any of it. I paused, but I do not think that anymore. What do you think now? I considered it honestly, the way I tried to consider all things honestly now, as a practice and a discipline and a form of respect for the version of myself that had been denied honesty for so long. I think I would just tell her that the parking lot is not the end of the story, I said, that the gray dress and the sleet and the man reading from a clipboard, all of it, is not the conclusion. It is the exit. I turned to look at him. From one thing into something else entirely. Caden held my gaze in the way he had been holding it for a year, with the attention of someone who has decided that looking at this particular person is one of the more worthwhile things he does with his time. "You did not need to be warned," he said. "You already knew how to survive it. You had been surviving it for 3 years before that parking lot. You knew how. You had just never been given a reason to believe that surviving it would lead somewhere worth the effort." I thought about that. "You were the reason," I said. "Not romantically. Precisely. Not because you rescued me. You did not rescue me. You were the reason because you stood in a parking lot in November and you looked at me, actually looked, and you said, 'This is not what you have been told it is.' And that was the first true thing anyone had said to me in 3 years." He was quiet for a moment. "It was not a difficult thing to see. It was, actually, for everyone else who had been looking at the same thing for the same amount of time." Riven fell down, face first into the grass, with the committed totality of a small person who has not yet developed a complicated relationship with gravity. Both of us moved simultaneously, the instinctive parental flinch, and then both of us stopped because Riven was already pushing himself up, already sitting back on his heels, already looking at the grass with an expression that was less distress and more assessment, as if cataloging the properties of the ground for future reference. He looked up at us. He smiled, which involved his entire face and both of his mismatched eyes, one amber and one violet, and the small pulse of light that escaped from his palm this time was less a spark and more a small, sustained glow, as if the smile had overflowed into his hands because the rest of him was not large enough to contain it. Caden made a sound. It was the sound I had first heard in the transport on the mountain road, the one I had decided belonged to him and would not be translated or described, and it was quieter here in the garden than it had been there in the wreckage, but it was the same sound. And I understood it now the way I understood a great many things I had not understood before. This year, he stood up and crossed the grass and crouched down in front of his son, and Riven grabbed his face with both hands in the way that small children have of treating the faces of people they love as territory. And Caden let him, and the glow from Riven's hands gilded both of them in the late afternoon light, amber and violet together. I watched them. I had been thinking lately about the word family, not the concept of it. I had understood the concept in the abstract for my entire life, had been aware of its existence as a category of human experience that I was adjacent to rather than inside. I had thought about it clinically. The way you think about a language you have studied but never spoken in a country where it is the native tongue. I understood its grammar. I had never been inside it. What I was inside now was not a theory. It was a man in a garden picking up his son with both hands and swinging him into the air, while the son shrieked with the particular joy of a child who is completely certain that the hands holding him will not let go. And it was the warmth of the stone bench under my palms, and the smell of apple blossom, and the sound of the forest below, and the absence of the cold that had lived in my bones for 3 years, and had left so completely that I sometimes forgot it had ever been there. I placed my hand on my abdomen, not from the outside, from the inside first, the way I had been doing since Wren had told me 3 days ago, in the same quiet, professional voice she used for all information regardless of its weight, that Riven was going to have a sibling. I had sat with it for 3 days, turning it in my mind the way you turn something to find its true shape. I had thought about what it meant, not politically, not dynastically, but specifically, in the particular register of a woman who had been told for 3 years that this was a thing she would never have and had spent 3 years in the process of believing it. I was going to tell him today. I had decided that this afternoon, in this garden, with the apple tree in blossom and the spring finally arrived, was the right moment. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the opposite of dramatic. Because after everything that had been dramatic and loud and shattering, this felt like the correct register for something this quiet and this enormous. Caden came back to the bench with Riven on his hip. Riven's fist closed around the lapel of his father's jacket with the proprietary confidence of someone who has decided this particular person is their territory. He sat down. Ren came to see me on Tuesday, I said. He looked at me. Riven is going to need a distraction, I said, in approximately 7 months. The stillness that moved through him was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of someone receiving information that is too large to process quickly and is choosing to process it correctly rather than fast. His amber eyes moved from my face to my hand, still flat against my abdomen, and back to my face. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed his hand over mine, large and warm and completely steady, and the contact completed something between us that I did not have language for and did not need language for. Riven, sensing a shift in the emotional weather with the unerring instinct of small children for the emotional states of the people who love them, looked between us with his mismatched eyes and then placed his own small hand on top of Caden's. Because he had apparently decided this was an activity that required his participation. We sat like that for a moment, 3 hands in a garden in the spring. Then the gate opened. The messenger was young, one of the palace runners, and the look on his face was the particular controlled urgency of someone who has been trained not to alarm the people he serves, and is finding that training difficult to maintain. He bowed at the required distance, the respectful distance that the staff had been observing since the first week, not because they had been instructed to, but because they had made their own assessment of what they were in the presence of and adjusted accordingly. "Your Majesty," he said to Caden, and then corrected himself with a slight inclination toward me that was also, I had come to understand, genuine. "Your Majesties." Forgive the interruption. Caden's hand remained over mine. "Speak." "The paper recovered from Isolde Farron's possession at the time of her arrest. The intelligence team has completed the full verification." The messenger paused. "The signature is confirmed. The individual in question is known to the Crown's historical records. They were present at the Regional Council 17 years ago, before Your Majesty's accession." Another pause, shorter. "They were documented as an associate of the Crescent Moon faction of Mara's parents." The garden was very still. "They knew about me," I said. "Not a question." "From before you were born, Your Majesty. The team believes they have been monitoring the White Wolf bloodline since your parents were killed, waiting to understand what form it would take in the next generation, waiting to understand what you would become." The messenger straightened. "They were seen at the northern border 2 days ago. They were not alone. They had a child with them." He held my gaze with the careful directness of someone delivering the specific part of the information they have been instructed to deliver clearly. "The child presents markers consistent with the White Wolf bloodline." The apple blossom moved in the breeze. Riven made a sound in his father's arms, a small questioning sound, as if he too had felt the shift in the air and was deciding how to categorize it. I stood up. I did not feel afraid. I want to be honest about that, because fear would have been a reasonable response, and the absence of it was notable. What I felt was the thing I had felt on the night of the full moon, when I had gone down into myself and found the wolf waiting, patient and unhurried, and entirely certain of what she was. What I felt was the thing I had felt at the top of the ballroom stairs in the silver gown, looking out at 500 wolves who did not yet know what they were about to witness. Ready. Caden was already standing beside me. Riven settled on his arm, his free hand at the small of my back, warm and present and asking nothing, simply there. I looked at the messenger. "Tell the intelligence team to hold their position," I said. "Do not engage. Do not approach." I paused. "The child is not a threat. Act accordingly." The messenger bowed and went. We had reached the shrine 3 days after Riven was born. Caden had insisted, even with a newborn in the transport and Wren protesting the timing. I had not needed convincing. I could still feel the draw of it, the low hum at the base of my spine that had survived the ambush and the birth and the long, pale pre-dawn hours of that night. We drove the remaining half hour on a road cleared by the Royal Guard, and when I stepped out at the edge of the ancient stones, I felt the ley line rise up through the soles of my feet and move through me like a current, finding the path it had always been meant to follow. I held Riven against my chest, and I stood on the oldest ground in the territory, and I let it feed us both. It took perhaps 20 minutes. It felt like setting down something very heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. When it was done, the particular drain that had been pulling at my core since the first weeks of the pregnancy was gone. Wren's monitors confirmed what I already knew from the inside. We were stable. Both of us. All three of us, as it turned out, though I did not know that yet. The name on the tattered paper from Isolde's pocket was Aldrich Vane. Caden had known it from the regional council records, a wolf who had been present at 3 separate historical junctures involving the Crescent Moon bloodline. A wolf who had survived every political reorganization of the past 30 years by knowing which side of information to be on. Not an enemy in the simple sense. Something more complicated. Someone who had been watching the White Wolf bloodline the way a collector watches something rare, with patience and intent, and a purpose that had not yet made itself entirely clear. He had a child with him at the northern border. That was what mattered now. I looked at the apple tree, at the blossom, white and transient and entirely indifferent to what was happening beneath it, as blossoms always are. At Riven, who had fallen asleep on his father's shoulder in the abrupt and total way of small children who have decided that the current situation does not require their consciousness. A year ago, I had stood in a parking lot in a gray dress and been cataloged as inventory and sent toward a life that had been designed to make me invisible. And now, I turned to Caden. "Someone out there has been watching my bloodline for 24 years, I said, watching it, studying it, waiting to understand what it would produce. I held his gaze. And there is a child who carries what I carry, who may have grown up the way I grew up, without knowing what they are, without knowing what they come from." Caden looked at me with the patient amber steadiness that I had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a very great deal of it, organized and directed. "What do you want to do?" he said. Not, "What should we do?" Not, "What is the strategic response?" Not even, What do you think? What do you want? The question of someone who has spent a year learning the difference between those formulations and choosing the one that belongs to the person standing in front of him. I looked at the northern horizon, where the mountains rose above the tree line, where somewhere beyond the border a child was moving through the world without a name for what they were. I thought about a 4-year-old girl in a beige office. I thought about what it would have meant to that girl to have someone arrive who knew her name before she knew it herself. Not to rescue her, just to say, I see what you are. I know where you come from. You are not alone in this. My eyes were burning violet in the late afternoon light, and my hand was over the small new life that was barely yet a presence. And my son was asleep on his father's shoulder with his mismatched eyes closed, and his small fist still wrapped in the lapel of his father's jacket. And the apple blossom was falling around us in the spring air, white and unhurried and briefly, extravagantly beautiful. We go north, I said. Caden nodded. Once, the nod of someone who already knew what the answer was going to be and had been waiting, without impatience, for it to arrive. The White Wolf's reign had not ended in a ballroom. It had not ended on a mountain road with fire and violet light and a child born into the wreckage of other people's hatred. It had not ended here, in a spring garden with apple blossom in the air and everything, finally, arranged honestly around us. It was not ending. It was doing what all things that are truly alive do, the only thing they know how to do, the thing that cannot be suppressed by 3 years of poison or the cold arithmetic of men who mistake silence for absence. It was growing.